Imagine standing in a dimly lit chamber beneath the sands of Thebes, the air thick with incense and the weight of divine silence. A priest approaches an alabaster altar, his hands trembling as he raises a bronze blade toward a figure lying motionless before him. The ritual about to unfold was not meant for human eyes. What he was about to perform would blur the line between worship and horror, between sanctity and sin. Because in ancient Egypt, acts that modern minds would call obscene were once considered sacred keys to cosmic balance. You think you know ancient Egypt, the gold, the pyramids, the gods, but what you're about to discover will dismantle every image you've ever had of that civilization. Their sexual practices weren't just private indulgences, they were the very machinery through which life, death, and divine order were maintained. What if the most shocking rituals in history weren't the ones hidden in brothels, but those performed in temples? The belief that sexual energy was a form of divine power created a world where no act was too extreme in service of the gods. Egyptian priests taught that every human body was a vessel of divine creation, and through sexuality, one could connect with the spiritual forces that sustained the universe. This wasn't symbolic. It was literal. Every union, every act, every ritual touch carried cosmic weight. And at the center of this divine drama stood the pharaoh, whose virility was believed to control the very flooding of the Nile. His satisfaction wasn't personal. It was national survival. When floods failed or plagues struck, the blame often fell on his supposed lack of divine potency, leading to increasingly desperate rituals designed to restore cosmic order. Archaeological findings suggest that temple chambers once served as sacred spaces for what we might now call sexual ceremonies. Walls depict priests and priestesses locked in positions that Victorian scholars later tried to erase from public records. The lotus, symbol of rebirth, often appeared in these depictions not just as an artistic motif, but as a euphemism for the sexual organs, both male and female. It represented fertility, divine pleasure, and the eternal cycle of death and resurrection. What's even more disturbing is how these rituals sometimes involved participants far too young to understand their role. Within temple hierarchies, young initiates were taught that surrendering their bodies was an offering to the gods, a way to merge human life with divine will. To refuse was to risk spiritual exile. Among the most unsettling discoveries are papyrus fragments describing what Egyptologists call the union of the sun and earth ritual. It was believed that the gods themselves had modeled the act of creation through sexual union. During certain ceremonies, the high priest would symbolically reenact this divine act, often under the influence of lotus-derived hallucinogens. Participants claimed to feel the presence of the gods move through them, a sensation they described as both ecstatic and terrifying. Some scholars believe that animal sacrifices performed during these rites represented the moment when divine life entered mortal flesh. The boundaries between man, beast, and God dissolved in a frenzy of incense, chanting, and physical release. But the darkness went deeper. In elite circles, physical modification was part of spiritual preparation. Bodies were altered to reflect divine perfection. Some mummies show evidence of surgical procedures performed around the genitals, removal, reshaping, or insertion of foreign materials. Acts interpreted as attempts to align mortal anatomy with divine forms. These weren't punishments or accidents. They were offerings, an attempt to refine the human vessel into something worthy of eternity. The irony is that these acts, so brutal by today's standards, were seen as the highest devotion. The priests performing them believed they were serving creation itself. Imagine a young temple acolyte standing before a carved statue of Hathor, goddess of love and fertility, her body trembling under the gaze of priests chanting ancient hymns. She's handed a cup filled with a mixture of beer, opium, and lotus resin. As the world spins into a blur of gold and blue, she feels herself becoming something else, a conduit for divine energy. What follows isn't a ceremony of tenderness, but one of transcendence. Every gesture, every touch, every sound echoes with the belief that through her, the gods renew the world. To the priests, this was not exploitation, it was salvation. Even in death, sexuality didn't end. The mummification process included rituals intended to preserve sexual potency for the afterlife. Inscriptions found in burial chambers detail how embalmers performed rites to awaken the seed of Osiris, ensuring the deceased could continue their divine function beyond death. In some royal burials, phallic symbols were attached to the bodies, while others, like the boy King Tutankhamun, were found with missing genitals, possibly as part of a sacred mutilation intended to transfer fertility power back to the gods. The more archaeologists studied these patterns, the clearer it became that Egyptian sexuality wasn't about pleasure at all. It was about power, life, and cosmic continuity. What's even more haunting is how these rituals blurred moral boundaries so completely that abuse became indistinguishable from worship. Temple texts describe children of the dawn, young boys and girls selected for divine service before puberty. These children were trained, conditioned, and sometimes permanently altered to become living offerings. They were seen as pure vessels, unmarred by worldly experience, ideal for housing divine energy. The pain they endured was considered necessary, a sacrifice to keep the gods appeased. Their lives were predetermined from birth, their deaths often celebrated as sacred unions rather than tragedies. Across Egypt's long history, this philosophy of sacred sexuality evolved into a complex system that governed every class. The pharaoh performed divine unions, priests maintained temple rites, slaves and servants acted as ritual participants. No one was untouched by the idea that their physical body belonged not to themselves, but to the cosmic order. Yet in the shadows of this grand theology, human suffering festered unseen. When the Nile failed to flood, when disease swept the land, the people turned again to these acts, convinced that only through greater submission, greater sacrifice, could harmony be restored. The deeper archaeologists dug, the more disturbing the picture became. Tomb paintings, once admired for their artistic beauty, began revealing explicit scenes once dismissed as mythological allegory. But forensic analysis proved otherwise. The positions, the proportions, the anatomical precision, they were real depictions of acts performed in life. Victorian archaeologists, terrified of scandal, destroyed hundreds of these findings or sealed them in restricted archives. What they couldn't face was that one of humanity's most advanced civilizations had tied its spiritual survival to rituals of sexual domination and violence. To understand ancient Egypt's greatness, you must also face its darkness. Because for them, the act of creation and the act of destruction were one and the same. Picture the dawn breaking over the ancient city of Heliopolis, where priests prepared for the festival of Ra. Thousands gathered by the riverbanks, chanting hymns as the first rays of the sun pierced the horizon. But hidden within this sacred celebration was something the official scrolls never mentioned. Beneath the hymns and incense, deep inside temple sanctuaries, priests performed what they called the renewal of the divine essence. It was a ritual that required the merging of human bodies to symbolize the union of heaven and earth. Those chosen for this rite were considered blessed, yet many were slaves, captives, or temple children raised for this single purpose. What appeared to the people as a moment of cosmic rebirth was, in truth, a scene of silent suffering wrapped in sacred theater. The renewal rites were meticulously organized. Priests would prepare their bodies through fasting and purification, while priestesses drank mixtures of wine and blue lotus to induce trance-like states. When the ritual began, Music and rhythm took control. Flutes, drums, and chants built a tempo that synchronized every movement into a kind of orchestrated frenzy. The participants' ecstasy was seen as proof that divine power had entered them. Each climax was not an act of pleasure, but a sacred explosion of energy, believed to nourish the gods themselves. The spent offerings, bodily fluids, incense smoke, and candle ash were collected in sacred jars, later buried near temple foundations to bless the land. Egyptian texts also describe secret ceremonies held during eclipses, moments when they believed the balance between life and death was at its most fragile. During these rare events, priests and initiates would enter underground chambers lit by torches shaped like serpents. There, they would engage in acts meant to mirror the cosmic struggle between light and darkness. Participants wore masks of deities, Isis, Osiris, Horus, and Seth, symbolizing the eternal conflict of divine energies. The chaos that erupted inside those walls was justified as the reenactment of cosmic order being reborn. But beyond the mythic symbolism lay acts so extreme that later civilizations would erase them from memory. Evidence from hieroglyphic inscriptions suggests that even animals were drawn into these rituals. Bulls, sacred to Apis, were often involved in fertility rites representing masculine vitality. Female participants, draped in linen dyed red with ochre, would anoint themselves with oils before touching or lying beside the sacred animal, a gesture meant to channel the god's virility into the human realm. Though symbolic to the priests, these acts horrified later historians. Yet, to the Egyptians, there was no profanity in blurring the lines between the human and divine. To them, the universe was one endless act of creation. Sex, birth, death, and rebirth cycling in divine rhythm. Even Egyptian mythology reflected this obsession. The story of Isis and Osiris, perhaps the most famous in their pantheon, contains clues to these beliefs. After Osiris was murdered and dismembered by his jealous brother Seth, Isis gathered his body parts to resurrect him. According to temple inscriptions, she crafted a phallus of gold to replace the one lost in the Nile and used it to conceive their son, Horus. This myth was not just a story, it became a model for ritual. During certain festivals, priests reenacted this union using symbolic objects or real participants to ensure the fertility of the land. What to outsiders seemed grotesque was, for Egyptians, the highest form of devotion, a reenactment of divine love that sustained the world. But behind the golden incense lay an undercurrent of terror. Those chosen for these rites were not volunteers in the modern sense. Many were bound by debt, birth, or religious duty. Some were taken as offerings from noble families eager to gain divine favor. Others were enslaved children trained from infancy to serve as vessels of the gods. For them, life was a cycle of preparation, ritual, and exhaustion, ending often in early death. Archaeologists have found skeletal remains of young individuals within temple complexes, showing signs of repeated trauma, malnutrition, and ritual scarring. Their pain was buried beneath marble floors, erased from official history, but written into the very foundations of Egypt's temples. The Feast of Drunkenness, one of Egypt's most infamous festivals, pushed these practices to their extreme. It began as a celebration of the goddess Hathor, but devolved into a week of chaos and ecstasy. Participants believed that to become one with the goddess, they had to lose all sense of self through intoxication. Beer mixed with narcotic lotus essence flowed endlessly, and soon the entire city became an altar of madness. Historical accounts describe women dancing naked through the streets, priests collapsing in ecstatic fits, and men driven to violent acts under the influence of divine possession. When consciousness returned, many could not recall what they had done. Some called it a miracle, others called it hell. The political elite used these festivals for control. By granting the population one sanctioned period of chaos, they diffused resentment and reinforced loyalty to the pharaoh. The people believed that through their debauchery, they restored balance to the cosmos. Meanwhile, the rulers watched from gilded balconies, knowing that the chaos they encouraged would ensure obedience the rest of the year. For the common Egyptian, these festivals offered a brief escape from the rigid hierarchy that defined their lives. But for the enslaved, the poor, and the temple children, it was a nightmare they could not wake from. The gods demanded pleasure, and they were the price. As centuries passed, these practices began to erode under foreign influence. When Greek and later Roman powers took control, they were horrified by what they found in Egypt's temples. Greek scholars documented secret chambers filled with explicit imagery and instruments of ritual use. Many of these accounts were so graphic that they were dismissed as exaggerations, yet excavations in the modern era proved them right. The Romans, repulsed by what they saw as barbarism, outlawed the old festivals and executed priests who refused to abandon them. They burned thousands of scrolls and defaced temple art to erase any trace of Egypt's sexual religion. But erasure couldn't undo the damage. Generations had been shaped by doctrines that turned the body into a tool for divine manipulation. When the rites were banned, Egyptians didn't just lose their religion, they lost their identity. Many fell into despair, unable to comprehend a world where their suffering no longer had cosmic meaning. Even after Rome's conquest, fragments of these beliefs survived underground, in secret cults and hidden writings. The echoes of those acts still linger in the ruins, whispering a story that history tried to silence. When archaeologists in the late 19th century began to unlock the sealed tombs of Egypt's forgotten dynasties, they expected treasures, not horror. Beneath layers of gold leaf and linen wrappings, they discovered carvings and inscriptions that no museum dared to display. Scenes once interpreted as allegories of fertility were revealed under better light to be vivid portrayals of acts that would make modern audiences recoil. Victorian scholars were so disturbed that many ordered the walls replastered, the artifacts destroyed or quietly stored in private collections. Their fear wasn't superstition, it was reputation. How could they tell the civilized world that its most admired ancient empire had built its glory upon rituals of sexual domination and human sacrifice disguised as worship? In one hidden chamber beneath the temple of Dendera, early excavators found reliefs showing priests performing intimate rites on mummified figures. What shocked them most wasn't the imagery itself, but the precision, every motion carefully depicted, every instrument labeled in hieroglyphs. These were not scenes of chaos, they were procedures, spiritual surgeries meant to alter the soul through the body. Later analysis of the inscriptions revealed instructions for reanimation through union, a process in which the body of the dead was symbolically fertilized to ensure resurrection. Some of the mummies from this site showed chemical traces of oils and resins that could only have been applied through invasive rituals. Such discoveries revealed an uncomfortable truth. In Egypt, sexuality was not merely human, it was cosmic. The same act that created life was believed capable of resurrecting the dead. This conviction drove priests to perform rites that blurred every boundary of morality and mortality. The god Osiris, murdered and resurrected by his wife Isis, embodied the principle that creation and corruption were inseparable. Every ritual that mirrored his story promised eternal life, no matter how grotesque its execution. For the Egyptians, the horror was holy. The obsession with divine sexuality extended into art and architecture. Temples were designed as symbolic wombs and phalluses, with corridors shaped to represent the passage from conception to rebirth. Even the placement of statues followed erotic geometry. Male deities facing female ones across sacred courtyards, locked in perpetual union through alignment and light. During solstices, Sunlight would penetrate temple halls in precise patterns, illuminating carvings of mating gods. These displays were not decorative but functional, designed to reactivate the mythic act of creation every year. In their quest for eternal balance, the Egyptians transformed their landscape into an enormous body, Nile as lifeblood, temples as organs, pyramids as seeds of rebirth. Every festival, every offering, every sacrifice became part of this living system. But to maintain it, someone had to pay the price. The lower classes bore the burden of feeding both the physical and metaphysical needs of the state. Farmers gave grain, soldiers gave blood, and temple servants gave their flesh. The pharaoh's body, both feared and worshipped, became the focal point of this exchange. His sexuality was not his own. It was national property. When he aged or failed to produce heirs, priests sometimes orchestrated divine rejuvenation ceremonies. Rituals in which younger partners, often chosen from noble families or temple slaves, were offered to restore the king's vitality. Failure in these rites could mean execution for both the priest and the partner. Even foreign travelers recorded rumors of these practices. Greek historians like Herodotus mentioned strange customs involving sacred unions and temple prostitution, though his accounts were often dismissed as exaggeration. Modern archaeology has proven that he understated more than he embellished. Inscriptions unearthed from the Temple of Luxor describe the Feast of the Twin Suns, where men and women engaged in mass ceremonies intended to simulate the creation of the universe. The entire act was accompanied by chants invoking fertility and the rebirth of Ra, the sun god. What took place within those torchlit chambers was not drunken chaos. It was rehearsed devotion, every motion choreographed to mirror divine order. As the centuries passed, these acts took a darker turn. When droughts plagued the land or foreign armies threatened Egypt's borders, priests declared that the gods demanded stronger offerings. The victims shifted from symbolic to human. Young acolytes, once trained to serve in temple rites, were now sacrificed in rituals of sacred renewal. Archaeological evidence suggests that their bodies were often buried beneath temple thresholds, a literal foundation offering meant to ensure divine protection. Modern forensic studies on remains found near Thebes revealed consistent signs of ritual trauma, confirming that these were not isolated incidents, but state-sanctioned ceremonies. When Christianity eventually swept across Egypt, its leaders denounced these acts as demonic. Temples were burned, priests executed, and rituals outlawed. But traces of the old religion survived in secret, carried by those who still believed the gods would one day return. In remote villages, farmers whispered invocations to Isis before planting crops, and midwives recited Osirian prayers during childbirth. The overt sexual imagery disappeared, but the idea that life itself was born from sacred union lingered on, reshaped into new faiths and myths. The modern rediscovery of this hidden history began in the 20th century. As science advanced, so did archaeology. CT scans and DNA analysis allowed researchers to look beneath the wrappings without unrolling them, revealing anatomical modifications previously unnoticed. The missing genitals of several royal mummies, once attributed to decay, were confirmed as deliberate removals. These findings reignited debates that Egyptologists had buried for generations. Was this evidence of punishment, purification, or devotion? The truth, most now agree, lies in all three. The world was finally forced to confront what the Victorians could not. Egypt's civilization, for all its wisdom, was also built upon rituals of extraordinary cruelty disguised as divine necessity. Yet even within that cruelty lay a profound understanding of the human condition. They saw sex not as sin, but as the heartbeat of creation, the endless pulse of death and rebirth. It was a truth they pursued too far until reverence became obsession and faith became violence. In the end, Every empire leaves behind its secrets, and Egypt's are written in stone, preserved in silence. For 3,000 years, they believed that to serve the gods, one must surrender everything: the body, the soul, even the will to resist. And though their temples now lie in ruins, the echoes of those chants still vibrate through time, reminding us that the distance between worship and corruption is thinner than we'd like to believe. If this journey through Egypt's forbidden past has reshaped the way you see history, then stay with me. There are countless more stories buried beneath the sand, waiting to reveal the shadows of civilizations we thought we knew. Tap that subscribe button, share this with someone who can handle the truth, and prepare yourself for the next descent into the ancient world's darkest rituals. Because the past isn't dead, it's just waiting to be unearthed. When the 20th century's veil of propriety finally lifted, scholars began piecing together the fragments of what Victorian hands had hidden. Each artifact pulled from the sands of Egypt told a story of obsession, faith, and fear unlike any other in human history. Beneath the beauty of hieroglyphs and the majesty of temples lay a civilization that had intertwined sex and spirit so tightly that separating them became impossible. The Egyptians believed that every act of intimacy was a conversation with the gods, every touch an echo of creation itself. Yet the same devotion that elevated their civilization also destroyed countless lives. The most haunting truth was not that they practiced these rites. It was that they believed them necessary to sustain the universe. In a sealed chamber beneath Saqqara, archaeologists discovered a cache of papyri known as the Scrolls of the Red Lotus. The texts describe secret rites of Osiris performed only by high priests. They speak of an awakening through the flesh, where priests were instructed to feed the god with passion until his seed returns to the earth. Ritual objects found nearby included ivory phalluses, gold cups for libations, and carved figures of intertwined human and divine forms. Laboratory analysis revealed traces of blood, resin, and opium, ingredients used in ceremonies meant to blur the boundary between pain and transcendence. It was here that Egypt's deepest paradox came to light: the pursuit of divine perfection through human suffering. Further discoveries in Abydos confirmed that the cult of Osiris extended beyond the priesthood. Common citizens, desperate for blessings, participated in lesser versions of these rites. Couples would gather at night along the Nile's banks, engaging in symbolic unions under the stars. They believed that by mimicking the gods' acts, they could absorb fragments of divine essence. These nocturnal gatherings were seen as offerings, prayers expressed through the body. But as these public rituals grew in number, corruption seeped in. Priests began charging for divine participation, turning sacred devotion into commerce. The economy of worship became an economy of desire. During the reign of Akhenaten, the radical pharaoh who abandoned Egypt's pantheon to worship the sun god Aten, attempts were made to suppress these older practices. Temples of Hathor and Isis were closed and their priests exiled. But suppression only drove the rituals underground. In hidden chambers, initiates whispered forbidden hymns to the goddess, believing that if they stopped, the world itself would die. Akhenaten's reforms, though revolutionary, could not erase thousands of years of faith woven into every grain of sand. His successors restored the old gods, bringing back the very rites he had tried to extinguish, this time cloaked in even deeper secrecy. As Rome's shadow spread over the Nile, the empire's governors uncovered a land obsessed with what they considered blasphemy. Roman soldiers looted temples and burned archives, yet even they could not destroy everything. In 1822, when Jean-François Champollion decoded the Rosetta Stone, he unknowingly reopened the doors to those hidden chambers of belief. Each newly translated inscription exposed another layer of Egypt's intimate theology. The more scholars learned, the less they could deny. This was a civilization that viewed eroticism not as weakness, but as the engine of existence. Every pyramid, every temple wall, every statue of a god or goddess was a monument to that principle. Today, the remnants of these practices still ripple through time. The myth of resurrection, the symbolism of fertility, even modern wedding rituals carry faint traces of Egypt's divine unions. What began as sacred devotion evolved into the foundations of countless cultural beliefs about love, power, and immortality. But their story remains a warning. When faith consumes morality, when desire becomes doctrine, humanity loses itself in the name of divinity. The Egyptians sought eternity through the body, but what they achieved was something else entirely, a haunting legacy that refuses to die. Standing before the ruins of Karnak, you can almost feel it. The echo of drums, the murmur of chants carried on the wind, the pulse of rituals long silenced but never forgotten. The carvings on those ancient stones tell a story of passion and pain, of gods who demanded everything and humans who gave it willingly. They remind us that history is not clean. It's carved in blood, sweat, and sacrifice. And while modern sensibilities recoil at the thought of what was done in the name of cosmic balance, the Egyptians saw no sin in their devotion. To them, the flesh was merely another form of prayer. Perhaps that's why their monuments still stand, defying time itself. Because even in their darkest acts, they believed they were building eternity. They saw creation in every touch, resurrection in every breath, and immortality in every surrender. Their gods may have fallen silent, but the echoes of their faith still hum beneath the desert sands, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. If you've made it this far, you've traveled through one of history's most unsettling truths, the union of the sacred and the profane. But this is only one story buried beneath millennia of silence. So before you go, make sure you hit that subscribe button and join me on the next descent into humanity's forgotten shadows. Leave a comment below. Tell me which part of Egypt's hidden past stunned you most. Because together, we're unearthing the side of history they never wanted us to see. And trust me, what's coming next will make this look tame,